Thank you for coming to see this today, and just please excuse me if I seem a bit scattered or tired or something like that. I'm one of the three main organisers of the entire conference, and so I'm very close to death for this. And I'm probably slightly less prepared for this presentation than I would like to be, so I would beg your forgiveness if I'm using notes and various things that I wouldn't normally do. So I'm going to try and talk to you a little bit about Stoke. I don't particularly know why I'm talking about a small township in England, but I'll maybe try and refer it back to Stoke once I get started on my slides. The first bundle are not too bad, and then at the end I will be referring more to the pieces of paper and the red pen that I have in my hand. I should say as well that I'm presenting a lot of this work on behalf of not only myself but several of my colleagues, all of whom are employed within the Centre of Excellence for Rehabilitation Research at Strathclyde. And so I am going to try to take a little bit of an approach with regard to rehabilitation rather than very discrete biomechanical insight into Stoke. So I'll start off talking a little bit about a project which is called Envisage, and then another project which is called Grossi, and what that has helped us to do in terms of first attempts of real world experiences using virtual reality systems. And I'm going to try throughout to give you a little bit of an insight into the patient and the clinician's perspective that we've been working with. And I'll do that through some quotes and whatnot, and it's anecdotal, it's sort of qualitative. But a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last year or two has really been to do with interaction with all stakeholders, with patients, with clinicians, with regard to the design of these types of VR systems and what they need and what the starting point should be and how you can progress. So a lot of it is interview focused and focus group focused, if you forgive the horrible expression. And first of all, I'll just have a wee quick run over about what stroke rehabilitation services look like, at least in Scotland and probably the UK. I can't speak to any of your other home nations. I also get a very dry mouth when I speak, so I'm going to have to drink water from time to time, sorry about that. So, for stroke rehabilitation, it would take place within what's called the acute services within the National Health Service, the NHS for Scotland and the UK. Obviously, rapid identification of stroke is important, rapid response of stroke is important. The stroke units must be well equipped and work with multidisciplinary teams, and we can use pharmaceuticals if they're indicated for early clot busting and so on. Once the patients are medically stable and they are then discharged from the hospital, it's then really the rehabilitation in the community that my group and my colleagues and I work within. We're not engaged in research into the acute immediate care, but rather the subacute rehabilitation term. So traditionally, there are various different approaches that one might employ to try and improve the situation for patients who have suffered from a stroke. And a lot of the physiotherapeutic intervention anyway would be one-to-one, and it would be the therapist doing stuff to you, the stroke survivor. And it can be very difficult to practice that on your own in the community setting. And a lot of this rehabilitation there should be a wee knot in there. A lot of the rehabilitation things at the moment are really not hugely based on evidence, and we're trying to move towards that as well, to enhance the database of why rehabilitation strategies should be employed. The literature does suggest that early intervention is extremely important, and there's a relatively short window of opportunity to get maximum effect for these patients. Intensive practice is important, many repetitions, varied tasks, of course functionally oriented, and a level of immersiveness and motivating tasks can certainly improve the experience and also adherence to any rehabilitation strategy that you try to use. And I saw this exact same sentence, I think, in Jaap's knowledge of, I think he said knowledge of performance and result, which is actually much more correct English than I put on mine, so well done, man from the Netherlands. I would say that the current models of care are probably insufficient, certainly speaking to Scotland and the UK anyway, and there is some evidence to suggest that a majority of stroke survivors will still have functional limitations many months after they're infirmed. So for future stroke rehabilitation strategies, if we look at things again, Scottish Government white papers, AHPs as agents for social change and so on and so forth, talk a lot about supported self-management and professionally led but not directly supported services to empower users to help with their own rehabilitation strategies, and for third sector voluntary participants to help with that. And that sort of aligns us again, I think, with some of the things that Jaap was saying about tailoring off the amount of direct feedback you might get, where the initial rehabilitation sessions would be led and directed by professionals in virtual reality environments, and then you can find strategies to take those laboratory-based configurations into the home or into the community, where the feedback might be slightly less immersive or slightly less involved, but you can get the repetitive and long duration of intensity that you need. You need to take multi-dimensional approaches. You should try to encourage risk-taking and not be risk-adverse. If I've got time, I'll talk for a minute or two about one particular individual that we've had in for the last 10 weeks who is very up for taking risks, not risk-adverse at all, and to the extent that he really freaked out some of the clinicians with his want to get better. As I say, we don't necessarily want to have to rely on national health services and community-led rehabilitation strategies using appropriate technology. With the emergence of the technologies that are available to us, we just have to look at models that are coming up in the Far East and China, where they recognise, I think, very quickly that physiotherapists are absolutely wonderful, and I would never say anything other than that, but they're a limited human resource. And if we need to use enhanced rehabilitation technology to augment those traditional practices. This is a fairly horrible diagram, which you can read if you want to when you see the PDF. Essentially, all I wanted to show here was that I think that all of these sections can in some way be commented on or assisted with the use of virtual reality and rehabilitation technology. So read those at your leisure. I think they all can be helped out by the type of enhanced technology that we're trying to talk about here today. So, on to some projects. The first one is called Envisage, which is not really an acronym, although it's a nice, attractive logo. The red, green and orange you'll see come into play in a few of my videos in a second. Engineering, visualization and aging. So the purpose of Envisage was to explore a range of movement analysis technologies, from very simple wearable sensors which could be used in home and community settings, all the way up to more complex laboratory configurations, to look at a spectrum of different environmental settings and also several different clinical applications. So we can look at it sort of in terms of the complexity of the technology and the setting that we're in. So we go from home to hospital, that says hospital behind this wee arrow, home to hospital and simple to complex. And the 5 work packages within Envisage were in relation to falls prevention, joint replacement, upper limb stroke rehabilitation, lower limb stroke rehabilitation, and then ankle foot orthosis tuning for stroke rehabilitation. I'm not going to go into any of these in great depth because there simply isn't time to do so, but I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how we employed virtual reality to enhance, well, I say enhance, but I think it enhances things, but I suppose that's open to interpretation, to augment the therapy that the patients receive. This video does work. For some reason it takes about 5 seconds to go. will assume that most of you are familiar with that kind of thing. So we're just capturing motion capture data according to a bespoke biomechanical model. And once that has happened, we can then show a virtual reality environment. So this is for the AFO tuning package within Envisage. And with our clinical colleagues and the patients over a period of about a year, we identified 7 or 8 really key criteria that our orthotic colleagues determined to be the most important for tuning an orthosis effectively. And that was what was on that fan that you saw a moment ago. One of them is the so-called shank vertical angle at mid-mid stance. And you can see as the patient comes along here, when the left limb goes into stance phase, they get this fan comes up, and at mid-mid stance, we want them to be in the green zone, as opposed to the orange or the red. And if you show that either in real time or immediately after the walking trial, then it allows the patient to hopefully improves the dialogue between the clinician and the patient. We've found that it's helped the patient to understand more why the therapist is asking me to do this exercise again and again and again and again and again. And this helps them to understand why that's being asked of them. It also helps the therapist if they're doing the tuning process of the AFO and applying wedges and rockers, then they can immediately see the effect of a proposed prescription, and therefore they can increase the wedge size by a small amount or decrease the wedge size by a small amount to affect that shank inclination at mid-mid stance. There's the other ones. Thigh to vertical angle, hip and knee external moments. I'll try and remember the other ones in a second. And then the other ones are just simple step length, step width, cadence, and so on. So this package was developed to provide feedback for all of those really quite straightforward parameters that you might measure from somebody's walking. And because we were using the bespoke biomechanical model, we were also able to do it in the background and offline. We could do fully instrumented inverse dynamical analysis and try to identify any mechanisms that might be associated with the changes in simple outcome metrics. I'm going to skip to the end of this video, show you this other one. What we've also found to be useful is this, I think we sort of call this a smart table. And we can look at first of all videos of the 6-month assessment, 6-month follow-up, and if we compare that to the baseline, then because we get such slow and incremental changes during a long-term rehabilitation process, patients can become very discouraged because they don't think things are really happening. But in fact, you then show them their situation at the baseline versus 6 months down the line, and it can really give a very strong argument as to how much they've improved. I've included another video here, which I hope is going to run, just because it's a particularly nice example. You know how you like to pick out your best stuff for videos. This woman actually became extremely upset when she saw this, which wasn't our objective. But she said she had no idea how much she was using her trunk and shoulder protraction to be able to do that kind of reach and grasp task. And when she saw this, it really made her much more aware of what her situation was, and therefore her motivation to do rehabilitation activity was increased. And she did do much better after having been exposed to this kind of feedback. What I've got next is actually a clip of a video from Scottish Television News. So it runs, it's probably a little bit longer than I would like it to be, but I'm going to play it because there is a nice couple of statements in it, and we can also see how these things.
Good evening. People in the west of Scotland who've suffered a stroke could have a speedier recovery thanks to a new system developed by engineers at Strathclyde University. The programme works by converting health data into computer-generated animation so that patients can actually see how their body movement has been affected. Kellyanne Bishop reports.
Each year in Scotland, more than 12,000 people have a stroke. Rehabilitation can be a slow process, But at Strathclyde University, researchers in the Bioengineering department believe they've come up with a new way to help those recover from strokes and joint replacements a lot faster.
We as engineers understand the data that this kind of system produces, but most people are not happy with physics and maths and tables and graphs. So what we've been doing is we've been working with colleagues at Glasgow School of Art and with colleagues at Glasgow Caledonian University to build portable measuring kit like this, which we can then reanimate the data in a visual format.
So the idea is patients will be fitted with lots of reflective markers. The cameras will bounce infrared beams off each of them and calculate the location, and that in turn will allow clinicians to diagnose any problems in movement or assess improvements.
The engineers believe using computer animation rather than the usual graphs and charts will improve the effectiveness of rehabilitation because patients will understand their body better.
It will make a difference to stroke survivors who've got mobility problems following their stroke. From what I've seen of the technology, that it gives such powerful visual feedback, it really will help people with their rehabilitation and improve their movement.
We feel that this system has a lot to offer in that both the therapists and the clinicians and the patients can discuss biomechanics amongst themselves without the expert being present.
The animation system will be trialled within the NHS.
So that's a couple of things to highlight there are just that we do very strongly, well we believe, but we also are starting to collect a body of evidence that incorporating a trial steering group and stroke associations and patients and carers and all these people in their own care and in the development of their own rehabilitation strategies is extremely important. I'm probably not going to bother showing this other video, to be honest with you, because it's very much the same stuff. It's got some nice comments from individual patients and individual clinicians, but as I loaded it onto the computer, there seems to be an issue with the audio. So the video is not actually offering a huge amount that you haven't seen, and I can't hear the audio. So unfortunately you're not going to hear the comments that this particular patient had to say about it, but they were absolutely fantastic. Unbelievably complimentary. Right, so that was the Envisage project. The next project is GROSSI, which isn't quite as an attractive a logo, but it is a better acronym. So Gait Rehabilitation of Stroke Survivors in Immersive Environments. We're actually planning one just now called GRASSI, which is Gait Rehabilitation of Acute Stroke in Environment. My colleague Andy is really good at coming up with acronyms, so if you ever need one, let us know. I should also tell you that one of my other colleagues, Craig Childs, is going to talk about this project as well on Thursday morning. I'm not going to go into the detail of the biomechanics and the detailed results of this study today. If you are interested to see that, then Craig will be presenting those on Thursday morning. It's, again, with what I said at the beginning, it's kind of sort of a feasibility study to begin with. We're very interested to learn how acceptable this type of technology is to the stroke community and whether or not it also has implications for overground walking. Everything, as I mentioned earlier on, should be functionally oriented, and whilst we do use treadmill walking and believe that it does offer some really exciting possibilities for incorporation with VR, we do want to make sure that people can go out and walk about in the pedestrian environment as well. So this is 11 participants, feedback from 11 participants whose age range are sort of in their early middle age, early aging, I suppose. They had suffered their strokes anywhere from 1 year to 18 years before they came and saw us, and they had very varying capabilities when they came and saw us, with some of them only being able to achieve very slow walking speeds, and some of them walking probably more quickly than I do. We had a few people who used lower limb orthotics, some FES, some aphasia, and one of our participants had perceptual problems as well. So we wanted to try and get experiential anecdotal information from all of these people to try and understand more about what type of virtual reality systems and what type of visual feedback were acceptable to people with different situations. We did do data analysis of overground walking. We did do data analysis of treadmill walking using different treadmill modalities and using different levels of visual feedback. And there was also questionnaire-based analysis of outdoor walking assessment, but Craig will talk about that on Thursday. This is where I'm going to have to pick up my pieces of paper. Jaap mentioned that you're going to get a PDF of various slides and whatnot, and that is certainly the case. Something else that I'm going to provide Jaap to provide all of you is this, which is a sort of report of the interviews that we did. And I'm not going to stand here and read the 8 pages of text to you, but it talks about the different findings that we had with regard to first impressions of the system. And people are saying that they had lots of nerves and apprehension and saying, oh my God, what have I done? But then laughing and said that she found it great once that she was on it. Using the treadmill, we've got some information about that. Understanding the tasks is really important. All of the participants did say that they had a good understanding of tasks, but something that we also incorporated was almost like a triage before doing individualised rehabilitation sessions and assessments using MOCA, for instance, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, gives some really nice information on what the sort of baseline you should start at, because we want to ramp up the complexity of the visual feedback and ramp up the complexity of the virtual reality environment. The graphs and things like that, for instance, were always useful for the therapist, but only higher functioning stroke survivors found them to be beneficial in our experience. I think that this is maybe a slight deviation from the example that Jaap gave us about OA, where there's not necessarily a cognitive or a perceptual impairment as you would find in some stroke survivors. So we need to take that into consideration when we're designing the VR environments that are going to be used during rehab sessions. So yeah, understanding the tasks, there's some information there emphasising the importance of taking aphasia and other possible cognitive impairments into account. Safety is really important with this patient groups. There's an entire section on our safety report here, which talks probably more about the use of treadmill walking rather than virtual reality immersion. But if you can include that safety aspect with the VR, then this is the one patient I was talking about before, and he came, and I think on the very first session that he came in, I'm not probably overstretching it to say that he fell every 4 or 5 steps. He was really pushing himself, and sweat was pouring off of him, and the lead clinician had to leave the room a couple of times because he was so worried. But because we were on, at this point we were on one of the Motec medical carrying systems, which has fall arrest harness, and so he was never in danger of injuring himself, but he was stumbling and falling constantly. And by 10 weeks later, he was walking so much better, to the extent that he was now, to put it in a real world context, his wife, who we also interviewed, family and other members of other interested parties, his wife said he was now actually able to go to the shopping centre by himself and not have to hold on to her for support. So I think to a certain extent you get out of it what you put into it, and he certainly put in a lot. But the safety aspect is so important to allow that repetitive, long duration rehabilitation without any demotivating effect or indeed further injury occurring. As far as actual games and images themselves, all the games were enjoyable. In the Envisage study, if I can jump back for a second, the final part of that was breadboarding future games. And it was all with older adults who were 60 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years of age. And they were very happy to come up with all their own games. And they were quite fun as well. They had a van going along with ice cream falling out the back and pigeons flying around. And it was really good fun, and they loved it. So to involve those users in the development of VR games has been important in all the things that we do. Overall experience, really quite challenging, but a good challenge. Not a negative challenge, a good challenge. That's one thing. I probably don't have a huge amount more to talk to you about, but I will just flip through a couple of pages here to see if anything jumps out at me that I've forgotten to say to you, so please excuse me. I apologise for not being fully slick with my presentation. I'll improve it before Jaap sends it to you. Pigeons and ice cream, that's in red, I've said that. Safety first, I've said that. Yeah, our participant who had hemianopia did actually experience some motion sickness effects almost. So we do have to keep it simple for some participants, but we can do much more complex things for other patients within the same category of pathology. Yeah. One question that I suppose I would leave is that whether or not, there is still a question I think about what the best thing to do is with these things, because whilst we've found that the individualisation of strategies for patients is extremely important and can be extremely beneficial, obviously that then requires a more complex development of the software that's going to drive the VR, and can non-technically minded clinicians, I'm sorry if this sounds patronising, but how can we design these things so that they're very usable by clinicians and give the clinicians the variety that they need in order to provide rehab sessions without being difficult to do. So I'm still not quite sure exactly where the balance lies on that. Maybe it is that more technically minded professionals have to do the initial phases of the rehab session, and then when the feedback part fades off, we can design enhanced technology that can be run by anybody in their own home or by a community-based voluntary organisation. I'm not sure what the answer is to that, so I'd like to pose that. Anyway, I think that's all I have to say. Thank you for your attention. And Marilyn.
Any questions?
Oh, pardon me, yes. Hi.
Thank you. Both of you have mentioned now the kind of individualization of the interventions, and I'm wondering, I mean, from a clinical standpoint...
Could you use the microphone?
Sure. Sorry. Hi, Kristen Daigle, Kristen Daigle Zhao. I have jet lag. That was my maiden name.
Okay. That's fine with us. Yeah.
Only one person new in the room. So you both mentioned individualization for the patients, and I think for clinicians that makes sense. I mean, they see the patients and they're all of sort of different pathologies, and that's good. But I'm wondering if you've had to argue for funding mechanisms, trying to standardize your intervention in a way that you can say that it's individualized, but you're using the same intervention. You know what I mean? Like, have you had to argue that at all, or have you been able to just sort of use your own funding?
No, most of the work that we do anyway has to be funded by external funding bodies, whether they are research councils or charities. It will vary, but we do have to make that argument, and one way that we try to do it is to talk about, oh pardon me, is to try to talk about the intention to treat, rather than providing a definitive dosage of a particular game that therapists must conform to, which obviously makes the design of an RCT or something like that, for instance, easier. That's not why we do what we do, so we try to come up with a package of things, and to the funding bodies will describe an intention to treat for this amount of time with that type of intervention, but then that actually what is done has to be decided by the therapist on the day. It's really quite a difficult thing to do properly in acute situations. It's really hard.
Yeah, well, if I might add, well, personalizing doesn't not mean you can just do anything. Yeah, right. So it is limited to a certain amount of scenarios, so to say, that you have to pick from. Especially to pick from informed by the actual measurement or by the response from the patient. So in that way it's still standardized, but also tuned.
So you propose some paradigm where you say we're going to try these 4 things if needed.
Some treatments, some selection algorithm,
Actually, so just one last thing on that as well. There's another application which actually I'm presenting on Thursday, which is called the Goblin Post Office, which has actually been used with children with cerebral palsy to this point, and the algorithm never allows you to do better or worse than 50% of the score. So it's an application that is for everybody, but there's a sort of intelligent adaptive algorithm behind it, which individualises how difficult it is for each person. So the difficulty is something you can individualise as well as the actual application itself.
Another burning question to you, Andrew? Yes.
I just wanted to follow.
Yes. Please use the microphone because it's being recorded. Yes.
Sure.
Go on.
Just wanted to follow up this question which has been asked. One of the things which you haven't mentioned is the potential mechanism or suggested mechanisms underlying the effectiveness of this type of interventions. So if it is going to be individualized or is it going to be, to be used, you must say something about that. This is the approach, this is the possible mechanisms. What are they?
I'll be quite honest with you, I don't know what the mechanisms are thus far. Most and huge amount of the work that we've done today has been piloting and feasibility studies, and we've actually got, your colleague asked about funding, we've got major funding under consideration at the moment for the so-called efficacy and mechanism evaluation programme, and that is where we hope to be able to determine more about the mechanism of any effect. Just now, I'll be honest, I don't know.
Well,
if there's an answer,
I think there's a difference between neurological diseases, where retraining is much more complicated. When you consider it from a biomechanical point of view, because neurosteroids, the mechanisms are clear. It's just not very clear which patient employs which one. So it has to do with learning strategies.
Sure, because Andrew mentioned something with respect to the visual flow. For example, I thought that you were going down that route to say that, what the effect or the connection between the visual flow and the control mechanisms after that is. But
it's something that we are very excited about looking more at, but without having done the feasibilities, we were never going to get approval for funding for the mechanism evaluation. So that's, come back to Brisbane in 2 years.
Okay. Thank you. Last question? No. Please take the microphone next to you.
Jos van Hentegem from Middelpoort and Moors and KB Control for these microphones. Does it work actually?
I think,
it's recording.
Just going back to the previous question there about individualization, and I probably would support that kind of idea that these things have to be very much individualized, but then you make the task of someone to translate into a clinical application almost impossible. I would almost use the pun virtually impossible. And what you then would probably have to decide as a government or as a policymaker is, do you want to centralize centers that cover rehabilitation so that they have very advanced equipment available for rehabilitation, or do you still want to decentralize it to make sure the spread and the coverage is as wide as possible geographically? What would be your view on
that? My personal view is that decentralising will be much more difficult to achieve, but I definitely think that it's much more desirable. I completely agree with everything that you've said with regard to the difficulty of really deploying things into a day-to-day clinical environment who sees 70 patients every day who have a variety of different levels of involvement. It's extremely difficult to do that in a decentralised way, but I do think that that has to be the long-term objective, and if centralised facilities are the way to model that, to show that they work, then maybe policymakers in 5 and 10 years will put the funding in to allow decentralisation.
It's also got to do with the scenarios that we earlier mentioned. If you could limit it to certain scenarios, you can build in intelligence as well in this projects, but it's not that complicated. It can be a simple project with a lot of intelligence in it. Then it could be easily decentralized. And if the data is fed back to the universities, then they can do big data analysis to even improve it. I think Francis is going to mention that a little bit as well, in how to transfer it from laboratory results to actual results. All right.
Okay, the incorporation of telemedicine and tele-rehab would really assist with that.